Hey, hey, my friends, welcome to another edition of Uncle Henny's Campfire Stories, where I am going to read scary stories from even more scary stories for sleepovers live and read some of your comments, and we should have a good time. David Denoyer commented, hey, wait a minute, this isn't QVC. Oh, I got stuff to sell you, homie. I got stuff to sell you if you want to buy it. So we're getting ready to start yet another night. I don't even know how many nights in a row I've done this program, but I want to take a moment to thank everybody who tunes in every single week. Man, I think we've done like 15 of these. 15 weeks in a row, and I've been having a really good time. And I got to tell you that I feel like as social distancing and lockdown is continuing, I feel like, overall I feel better, but some days, man, it just starts to grind on me. And it's very nice to have this spot to be with you guys. So thank you all for joining me for another fun night. We're going to read some scary stories, scary stories for sleepovers. Also, full disclosure, Ray Cersei said 15 weeks. Oh, by the way, Craig Cohen said, hello, Henrik, good evening. Ray Cersei, thank you so much for being our first tip of the evening, followed immediately about 10 minutes later by Craig Cohen. Thank you so much, Craig, for both of you for tipping. It really means a lot to me. And also, Shane Migliavacca sent in a tip. Thank you so much. I think that with how kind of funky and stressed I've been the last week or so, I have a migraine, a pretty bad one, to be honest with you. It's starting to feel a little bit better. I think I can get through the stream pretty okay. I think that every tip that comes in today, I am going to spend recklessly on PlayStation 4 video games. I don't know which ones yet, but I'm going to get some PlayStation 4 video games, and that's what I'm going to do this weekend. It's just video game. So, Ray Cersei said, yes, I win. You do. Keith Tomlin said, I turned off Scott Pilgrim versus the World for this, so you better be good. I'm going to try. I promise. Craig Cohen said, nice, Ray. Craig and Ray have this incredible and very affable competition to be the first person to tip. I win the competition no matter what, so I appreciate you guys very much. Dwayne West said, hey, Henny, ready to be spooked. Well, my friends, I think it's about time we start the first story of the night. I do want to mention that once we finish, we are about halfway through even more scary stories for sleepovers, which means, Shane Migliavacca said, yes, do it. There's a Predator game. I actually have the Predator game. But once we finish this scary stories for sleepovers, we'll be moving on to the final. Not only the final one that we haven't read, but also just the final one that was ever published. Scary Stories for Sleepovers number 10. We'll be able to read this, and then I'm probably going to take a small break, kind of regroup, and decide what stories we're going to do next. And of course, I'll be accepting suggestions. So, but anyway, enough housekeeping stuff. I think it's time we get to the spooky stories, and then I can jaw at you in a little bit. I'm a little funky, all the pain medicine and stuff, so that'll only make the show more exciting. But please, also, sharing is scaring. Hit the share button and say, I'm listening to my pal read live scary stories, you should join us, or something along those lines, and send it out to the world. I would really appreciate it, because the more people that join us, the more fun we're going to have. But, for now, it's time for our story. The first one of the night is called The Power of the Mind. Arian, messed up on the name. Arian smiled at Robert, a grim-faced boy who shuffled toward his place in the back of the classroom. Hi, Robert, she said kindly. Jill leaned over from across the aisle and whispered, I don't understand why you're nice to that know-it-all creep. She watched him with obvious distaste as he slumped into his seat. Arian reached under her desk and took out her reading book. Oh, he's not so bad. Showing off how smart he is his way of getting attention. She shrugged her shoulders. I don't let it bother me. Besides, he doesn't have any friends. I feel kind of sorry for him. Jill wasn't convinced. Well, I think he's a Class A weirdo. It runs in the family. That isn't a very nice thing to say, Arian replied. Jill rolled her eyes. Maybe not, but you know it's true. Arian had to admit that Robert was a little strange, and everyone in town knew that his great-grandfather, Jebediah Gray, had been committed to a mental institution, and that he died there. Still, Arian believed that it was cruel of the kids to tease Robert about it, but he did have a knack for getting on everyone's nerves. Just as the bell rang, Mr. Cutter hustled into the room, balancing an armload of books and papers. "Good morning, class," he said, dropping the load onto his desk. He pushed his slipping glasses back into position. How many of you know what a myth is?" Several of the kids, including Robert, raised their hands. "Okay," Mr. Cutter said. "For the rest of you, myths are made-up stories about heroic people, legendary places, or supernatural creatures. Today, we are going to read a story about a mythical creature called Basilisk, a beast that was half giant snake and half rooster." Laughter rippled across the class. Robert, however, didn't crack a smile. "Don't laugh," the teacher cautioned. "This horrible monster was said to have had poison breath that could destroy anything it touched." He leaned forward and lowered his voice to a throaty snarl. "And one glance from its evil eyes could turn any living thing into clay." "Stone," a chilling voice from the back of the room announced with precision. Mr. Cutter looked up in irritation. "What?" Robert stared at the teacher, huffed impolitely, and repeated to himself, "Stone. The gaze of the basilisk turned people into stone." Peering at the boy over the top of his glasses, Mr. Cutter grumbled, "Oh, you seem to be quite sure of your facts, Mr. Gray. Are you personally acquainted with a basilisk?" Most of the kids burst into laughter. Red-faced, Robert stared hard at his hands, now clenched into tight fists in his lap. Later, during lunch, Arian found Robert sitting alone just outside the cafeteria. "Are you still angry?" she asked softly, leaning against the red brick wall of the building. "Mr. Cutter shouldn't have embarrassed you like that. I guess he was obsessed because you corrected him so rudely in class." "That doesn't give him the right to make fun of me," Robert answered quickly, "and to make everyone laugh at me," he added. "No, it doesn't. But maybe if you tried a little harder to—" "Oh no!" gurgled Joe Washington, one of their classmates. He and a couple of other boys were nearby, heading into the cafeteria. "I just saw the basilisk!" The basilisk! To the delight of his friends, Joe held his arms at his sides, stiffened his body, and pretended to turn to stone. "You're an idiot," Robert mumbled. "And we all know what you are," Joe shot back angrily. He turned to his friends, crossed his eyes, and used one finger to make a small circle gesture near the side of his head. Snickering, the group of boys moved on. Arian cast a glance at Robert. He was trembling with anger. "You're not very funny," she called out to Joe. "I think you're—" But she stopped when a sudden movement near the top of the brick wall caught her eye and turned her attention upward. A decorative concrete eagle perched at the top corner of the building and was vibrating. As she watched, a crack in the base appeared, and the stone bird shuddered and slowly toppled forward. "Look out!" Arian screamed. Joe jerked back in surprise, and the statue crashed to bits on the sidewalk, right in front of him. "Whoa," one of the boys murmured. "That was close." Turning quickly to Robert, Arian was shocked to see that he was smiling. "You know what, Arian?" Robert said slowly. "Maybe you're right. It was rude of me to correct Mr. Cutler in class. It would be much more effective for him to learn by experience. Perhaps he should examine the basilisk for himself." He threw his jacket over his shoulder and sauntered off, whistling tunelessly. "But it's a myth," Arian said aloud to no one. "It doesn't exist." When Arian walked into class the following morning, it was plain that something was wrong. The principal, Ms. Wareham, and Mrs. Gaudio, a substitute teacher, stood solemnly at the head of the class. When everyone was seated, Ms. Wareham spoke. "I'm afraid I have some very grim news," she said in a hushed tone. "I'm deeply sorry to say that Mr. Cutter passed away last night. The students sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Godillo has agreed to take over your class. All day, Mr. Cutter's sudden death was all everyone talked about. Then, after school, when Arian was leaving, she noticed a knot of children gathered around Carrie Lewis, the police chief's daughter. Out of curiosity, she joined them. It was too weird, Carrie was saying. My dad told my mom that they found Mr. Cutter curled up in the corner of his backyard, and he was only wearing pajamas. No robe, no slippers. Geez, Jill exclaimed. It must have been below freezing last night. Why would he go out like that? Who knows, Carrie said. Since a lot of furniture was turned over, my dad thinks there was some kind of a struggle and Mr. Cutter ran outside to get away. But that's not the strangest part. The girl lowered her voice to a whisper, and to the other children would lean closer. There was something wrong with Mr. Cutter's skin. It was really dry and hard. And you know what else? Everyone held their breath while waiting for the final detail. My dad said he'd never seen a more scared expression on a dead man's face in his whole life. He said he'd never forget it as long as he lived. As the other kids chattered excitingly, Ariane let Carrie's words sink in. There was something wrong with his skin, dry and hard, like stone? She wondered. Suddenly, a terrible thought came into her mind. Could Robert have had anything to do with what had happened to Mr. Cutter? Across the playground, she could see Robert and Joe. They appeared to be arguing again, and it looked serious. Joe grabbed Robert's jacket, and the two boys tugged at it for a moment. Finally, Robert wrenched the coat free, whirled around, and ran. Shaking her head, Arian set off for the library to do some research for a report she had to do for school. When she got there, Arian wasn't surprised to see Robert at a table in the reading room. He was hunched over a large book as if he were in a trance and didn't notice as she walked up behind him. His jacket, with a ripped sleeve, was slung over the back of his chair. Arian noticed that his total attention was on an illustration in an open book. She slipped closer and peered over his shoulder. It was a frightful drawing of a scaly winged dragon. Its lips were curled back over long, ghastly fangs, and tongues of flame poured from its flaring nostrils. Robert's hand rested on a second book, a small leather-bound volume on the table beside him, and he seemed to be muttering something over and over under his breath. Arian felt a chill of fear snake up her spine. Without a word, she edged away and left the library. Did you hear what happened? Jill cornered Arian as soon as she arrived in class the next morning. It's just so gross. The police discovered a body a couple of hours ago. It was fried to a crisp and stuffed up the top of a big old water tower by the refinery. Carrie says it took them an hour to get the body down and they still don't know who it is. Arian focused for a moment on the empty desk where Joe Washington usually sat. Then she shifted her gaze to Robert. She watched as he calmly ran his fingers along a freshly mended tear on the sleeve of his jacket. Mrs. Godillo began the morning lesson, but Arian couldn't concentrate. Over and over she said to herself that it wasn't possible. She was being ridiculous. How could Robert have anything to do with these terrible events? But her thoughts kept returning to the horrible dragon she had seen him studying so carefully. After school, Arian attended the meeting of her science club. This afternoon, they were discussing science projects to enter in the youth display at the state fair, but she barely paid attention. What do you think, Arian? She heard as if the voice were coming from a great distance away. What? Jill had slipped into the seat next to her. I said, what do you think about doing a model of a volcano? Are you all right? You haven't heard a word I've been saying. Arian stood and gathered up her books. I'm fine. There's just something I have to do. I'll see you tomorrow. And with that, she briskly took off. 15 minutes later, Arian was standing on the sidewalk in front of the 3-story town library. The old building appeared ominous in the fading light of an early midwinter evening. Still trying to make up her mind, she surveyed the intricate designs around the massive front door. The library had been built in the early 30s. and it was adorned with an array of gaudy decorations and carvings that were popular at the time. At the side of the building, a sweeping outdoor stairway led to a third-floor patio where evil-looking gargoyles guarded each corner of the building. Setting her jaw firmly, she strode up the steps. As she had expected, she found Robert at a table in the otherwise deserted reading room. The same mythology volume and small leather-bound book were in front of him. "Why?" she said firmly, more as a demand than a question. Without the slightest trace of surprise, Robert looked into her eyes. He knew exactly what she meant. "They deserved it," he replied bitterly. Arian felt her jaw drop. She had hoped that she was wrong about Robert, but now she knew her suspicions were true. A jumble of thoughts and fears reeled through her mind, but all she could say was, "How?" "Hate is a very powerful thing," Robert said simply. "My great-grandfather knew that. He realized that if it could be channeled properly, it could be used as a weapon. It's all here in his diary." The boy tapped the cover of the small book. "He didn't have the powers of concentration to make it work. But I do." He snapped with a sudden fury. "And whatever I imagine becomes real for as long as I concentrate." He spoke with such force that Arian flinched. "You've got to stop this, Robert," she pleaded, but he only laughed. "If you don't, then I'll find a way to stop you." "What can you do?" he grinned, stepping closer. Arian began to back away. "I'll go to the police." "Don't be stupid. They won't believe you." He softened his voice and reached out his hand. "You are the only person who's ever been nice to me. I don't want to have to hurt you." Twisting away, Arian marched to the library doors and down the front steps. Outside it was already quite dark, and the shops and businesses were closed for the night. The empty sidewalk was dotted with pools of light from the glowing street lamps. She paused for a moment, then turned in the direction of the police station. High above at the corner of the library rooftop, a grotesque stone gargoyle trembled slightly. Its eyes sparked to life like glowing embers, then it stretched its enormous bat-like wings and leapt into the air. Arian walked faster as she became aware of a soft whirring noise above. At her feet she saw dry, dead leaves skitter along the sidewalk as if pushed by a breeze. The air began to press in on her, and a voice deep inside screamed a warning. Without looking up, she began to run. Only a few yards overhead, the gargoyle let out a piercing screech and spread its glistening talons for the attack. Arian felt something smash into her from behind and went sprawling onto the ground. She twisted her head just in time to see the creature beating its inky black leathery wings against the cold night air. As it turned, she saw the horrible red gash of a mouth opening to expose its stabbing fangs. "No! No! Stay away from me!" she screamed. Springing to her feet, she dashed toward the town square and dove under the cover of a small white gazebo meant for picnickers. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she huddled in the tiny structure. But it was no use. The demonic creature plummeted with a full force on the fragile roof, and splinters of wood shot in every direction. Crying hysterically, Arian covered her ears, but she couldn't block out the beast's hideous shrieks. She bolted from the crumbling gazebo and scrambled into a hiding place under a holly hedge. The sharp spines of the leaves tore at her face and hands as she crawled, but it was worth it. The enraged creature continued to claw at the ruined gazebo and hadn't noticed her escape. Quickly creeping out from the holly hedge and keeping to the shadows of the buildings, she made her way back to the library. "Let me in!" she wailed, tugging on the brass handles and banging on the huge wooden doors, but they were locked. From somewhere in the darkness, she heard the cry of the gargoyle getting closer. Frantically, she looked around. The outside stairway! If she could make it to the third level, she could smash one of the library windows that faced the patio and crawl inside. Sobbing, Arian lurched first up one flight, then another. When she reached the third floor, her heart sank. Heavy wooden shutters were securely locked over each of the windows. "I warned you." Arian whirled around to see Robert standing near the edge of the patio. "I really am sorry," he said. Then he cupped one hand to his mouth. "She's here, my pet!" he called out into the night. With a blood-curdling howl, the savage gargoyle swooped down. At the last second, Arian pressed her trembling body against the wall, avoiding the attack. Robert wasn't as lucky. The edge of the beast's wing hit him in the shoulder. Crying out, he toppled over the low safety rail and plunged to the ground below with a grisly thud. All at once, the night was so still that Arian could hear the pounding of her own heart. Tisk, 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 the head librarian clucked to her young assistant the following morning. It was such a tragedy, but I've told everyone we need to put a gate across that stairway and lock it up at night. The poor boy must have slipped, and you should hear the story the little girl is telling. Gargoyles and dragons probably think she'll get into trouble if she tells the truth. As she spoke, the woman looked around the reading room, and her voice took a harsher tone. Look at this mess, Andrea. Why haven't you shelved these books yet? If this job is too difficult for you to handle, I can always find someone else, you know. I'll take care of it right away, Mrs. Jordan, her assistant mumbled, trying to hide her anger. The older woman always seemed to find fault with everything. Picking up a mythology book from the reading room table, Andrea read the number on the spine and slid it into its proper place. See that you do, Mrs. Jordan ordered and walked away. Next, Andrea picked up a small leather-bound volume from the table. Someday I'll find a way to teach that old battle axe a lesson, she muttered. Absent-mindedly, she flipped open the little book and began to read. I love anytime you get to use the phrase old battle axe is a good time. And I don't know why Ariane gave me such a tongue tie, but it did. So I apologize. I try my best. So let's see what you guys are saying. Keith Tomlin, thank you so much for your generous tip. Keith, this is especially for Ray and Craig. Keith put, this tip is for next week, so technically I win the next first tip contest. Shots fired, kids. Shots fired. But let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. Okay. Oh, goodness. Here we go. Ray Cersei said, oop, yikes. How he knows this. Ray Cersei, this is already better than the Chamber of Secrets. Shimmy Leavaca said, I have ELOs turned to stone in my head now. Ray Cersei said, gasp, ew. Then David Denoyer said, it's not a diary, it's a journal. Ray said to him, hush, Tom Riddle. Shin Migliavaka said, if the rail had been up to OSHA standards. Ray Cersei said, no, that's not how it works. Oh, see, Keith, you started a war with Ray and probably with a war with Craig, too. So, I mean, this is your fight now. I'm not even going to referee this one. So, how's everybody doing tonight? You guys having a good time? I mentioned earlier, I have a bit of a migraine going on, so I'm trying my best with the stream, but I know that I'm not at 110%, so I do apologize for that. But I am going to do my darndest. I'm going to do my darndest to do well, and I do want to thank you guys again for hanging out and for your generous tips. They mean a whole lot. And for those who missed the beginning of the show, because of all the stress that's been going on for the last week or so, I've decided that today, all tips given are going directly to being wasted on video games for the weekend. It's what I need to do. So, all right, my friends, let's say we do another story. Because I can, like, see, I get so self-conscious. I can, like, see how I look from the headache. So Ray Cersei said, I'm super itchy and actually going to bow out. Love y'all. Thank you so much for hanging out with us, Ray. And again, happy belated birthday. I wish you a happy birthday last week. I want to wish you a happy birthday this week since you're here live with us. So thank you so much for hanging out. Keith Tomlin said, don't hate the player, hate the game. We'll put that on your tombstone, Keith. All right. This story is called Family Reunion. Peter searched the landscape as it whizzed by. Water tower, Pete called out excitedly. Water tower starts with W. Now it's your turn. He glanced slyly at his big brother, Mark, who was sitting in the back seat beside him. You have to find something that starts with X. To pass the time on the long car ride from Phoenix to King City, Missouri, the family had been playing an alphabet game. The object was to take turns finding something that started with each letter of the alphabet. His mom and dad had lost interest somewhere around Q, but Mark had stuck with it. Although they were 10 years apart in age, Mark was very patient and attentive to his younger brother. Mark studied the farmland whizzing by outside the van window. Extra big cow, he finally announced with a straight face. That's not fair, Pete shot Mark a glance, but he really wasn't annoyed. Okay, I give up. You win, Mark said as he tickled Pete in the ribs. There's no way I'm going to see a xylophone out here. It was a long drive to the family farm. It was a long drive to the family farm to visit Uncle Ed, Aunt Belinda, and Grandma Ruby. Pete had been there several times before, but this time was different and very special. It was the 10-year family reunion. At the last reunion, he had only been a baby, so he didn't remember any of it. He'd certainly heard about it, though. A lot. There have been Collinses on this land since the Louisiana Purchase, his dad had always said proudly. Mark had actually been born there before their parents moved to Arizona. Now family members were coming from all over the country to gather in the small Midwestern village that was their ancestral home. Pete was going to get to meet aunts and uncles and cousins that he'd never met before, including Uncle Milo. He was the oldest person in the entire family. As they drew closer and closer to King City, Pete could hardly sit still. When the road-weary group finally pulled up to the large white farmhouse, Uncle Ed was standing on the porch with a big grin to greet them. Well, it's about time you got here, he boomed in a deep voice. Belinda's been staring out the window since lunchtime. As he spoke, a pleasant-faced woman in her mid-50s appeared and waved enthusiastically from the kitchen window. By the time the family was inside, Aunt Belinda was already setting out a hot meal in the dining room. Land sakes, she declared, laughing heartily. You must all be starving. Chatting and in laughing, everyone took a seat at the table. It was obvious, however, that there was one empty place. Where's Grandma Ruby? Mark asked. Belinda and Ed shared a serious glance. She's just feeling a little under the weather, Ed said finally. I'm fine. Everyone looked up to see the plump, gray-haired woman standing in the doorway. She stared back at them without smiling. It's all this fuss, she complained. I just can't stand it. All these folks coming here. Why can't they just get this business over with and quietly go home? Hi, Grandma Ruby, Pete said, surprised at her gruffness. Usually she was so nice whenever they paid a visit. The old woman turned and walked away down the hall without responding, but not before Pete had noticed her throat and the backs of her hands. They were covered with patches of dry, scaly skin. Belinda quickly launched into an apology. Grandma Ruby's not feeling herself, but she's going to be seen to very soon. Pete noticed that his mom and dad were nodding, knowingly. Come on, champ, get a move on, or I'll get all the pancakes, Mark said the next morning as he and Pete rolled out of their beds. Not if I can help it, Pete laughed, racing to grab his jeans. Moments later, they clambered into their places at the kitchen table. Still laughing, Pete bumped the table as he sat down, and a little orange juice slopped over the side of his glass. Can't you boys behave like gentlemen for once instead of hooligans? Aunt Belinda snapped. Everyone looked at her in surprised silence. Nervously, she used her napkin to dab up the small spot of juice on the tablecloth. Pete couldn't help but notice the small, dry patches of scaly skin on the backs of her hands. I'm sorry, Pete said timidly. He tried to change the subject. Is Grandma Ruby feeling better this morning? With a grim expression, Belinda looked at the other adults at the table. She's not well. She's gone away for a day or two. Away where? Pete asked. Just away, his aunt answered harshly, and with that, she stomped out of the room. Pete and Mark spent the early part of the day in town, and Pete was glad since everyone at home seemed kind of grumpy. Still, almost everywhere they went, they ran into a relative, and it didn't take long for Pete to realize that most of them were edgy and out of sorts, too. When he and Mark got home, Pete decided to talk to his parents about it. He found them in the living room going over some sort of printed schedule or timetable. "He should be ready by tomorrow," his dad said seriously. His mom was somber. "How do you think we should handle it?" "We'll leave that to Milo." When Pete entered the room, they stopped talking, and his dad slipped the timetable into a large plain envelope. "What's up, son?" he asked with a forced smile. Pete flopped down into an overstuffed chair by the picture window. "What's wrong with everyone?" he asked. "I thought this was supposed to be a big celebration, but no one seems happy." "Well," his mom began, "there are so many things to do, family traditions and all. People get irritable." A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. "Why, I wonder who that could be," Mr. Collins said, with a false cheeriness. It was Uncle Milo. If there was a center to the entire family, he was certainly it. Pete had no idea how they were related. Everyone called him Uncle. All of the adults treated him with respect, and Pete thought, fear. As Milo stepped inside, Pete felt his spine tingle. The old man looked like a walking corpse. His dry skin hung in loose wrinkles on his face, and a few white hairs stuck straight out from his age-spotted scalp. No one knew for certain how old he was. He had run the huge storage warehouse at the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. "George, Monica," Milo said gruffly as he nodded a greeting. Pete felt anxious as the aged man turned his dark gaze directly onto him. Without a word, Milo grasped the boy's hand and ran his bony fingers over the pink flesh. "Almost time," he wheezed under his breath. Pete was so transfixed by Uncle Milo that he barely noticed when Mark entered the room. "Uncle Milo," Mark said, extending his hand. Milo took it and gazed at it intently. Finally, he looked up and smiled like a hideous cadaver. "Yes, this is good. You come with me to the warehouse, boy," Milo ordered. Mark obeyed without question. He didn't even look at his little brother as he followed the old man out the door. "Why are they going to the warehouse?" Pete said, mostly to himself. He stood at the picture window. As he watched the pair leave, he absent-mindedly rubbed at a patch of itchy red skin on the back of his hand. A bright bar of sunlight falling across his pillow awakened Pete early the next morning. Rolling over, he noticed that Mark's side of the bed had not been slept in. "He didn't tell me anything about a fishing trip," Pete said, scowling when his mom explained where Mark had gone. "Well, maybe he doesn't tell you everything," his father snapped angrily. Pete didn't believe their explanation for a minute. His parents had never lied to him before. There was something going on, and he intended to find out what. Whatever it was, it had something to do with that warehouse. With late-night shadows darkening its time-worn walls, the warehouse looked creepy and distorted. It hadn't been difficult for Pete to sneak out of the house after everyone else had gone to sleep, but now it didn't seem like such a good idea. Taking a deep breath, he hoisted himself up through a partially open window. Once inside, he could tell why no one had bothered to lock the windows. The place was filled with broken-down farm equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Some of the rusty hulks were partly covered by tarps, which made the junk look like huge, crouching beasts waiting to spring. Suddenly, Pete heard a scuffling sound near the wall to his left. He switched on the small pen light he had brought with him and aimed the beam in the direction of the noise. A large pair of rat eyes glared back at him. The creature's greasy-looking fur shimmered in the dim light. It took a step forward toward him, then another. Pete glanced from side to side for a way to escape, but the rat abruptly turned and slinkered away. Pete let out a long sigh and bounced the thin beam around the area where he stood. On the far wall, he noticed a door. He moved quietly toward it, gripped the handle, and slowly turned it. The latch clicked and he pulled the door open to find a wooden staircase that led down into the blackness. "Okay, hero," he said softly to himself. "I guess this is what you have to do." Pete squared his shoulders and took a step, then another. Even though he was scared, he descended step by step into a huge vault-like underground chamber. As in the room above, there were tarps covering objects. He edged toward the object closest to him. Extending his trembling hand, he gripped the edge of the tarp and pulled it back. Ah! He stumbled backward away from the ghastly sight. There, on a smooth metallic table, lay the body of a man. It was wrapped in what looked like a coating of sticky threads, not unlike those of a spider's web or a moth's cocoon. Gathering his courage, Pete lifted up the tarp he was now leaning against. It was another body. "I don't believe this," he gasped. In the beam of his small flashlight, he could see dozens of covered tables. He reached out and lifted one more tarp. Tears blurred his vision. Mark's unseeing eyes stared back at him. He too was covered by the sticky layer of stuff. "No!" Pete cried out, touching his brother's face. It was cold and clammy. "We didn't expect you so soon, son." A pair of incredibly strong hands grasped Pete from behind and lifted him off his feet. It was Uncle Milo. "What have you done to them?" the boy screamed, kicking and trying to free himself from Uncle Milo's grasp. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this," the old man said calmly. "But it's too late now. We best get you home." With an iron grip, Milo guided Pete toward the now well-lit farmhouse. His frantic parents were waiting inside. The boy stared in disbelief. They looked as if they hadn't slept in weeks. His mother scratched continuously at the scaly skin of her arms and face. It peeled away in long, dry strips. "Where did you find him?" his dad asked with agitation. "In the warehouse," Milo growled. "He knows." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Milo," a gentle voice interrupted. "He's got to find out sometime." Pete snapped his attention to a figure standing at the hall door. It was Grandma Ruby. She looked younger and lovelier than he had ever seen her. She smiled sweetly and held out her arms to him. "Come here, child. Everything will be all right." Milo pulled Pete's sleeve back to expose the boy's arm. His skin was peeling in parched sheets. Terrified, Pete twisted out of Milo's grasp and backed toward the door. "Get away from me!" "Peter," his mother soothed. "Please, you have to..." Pete's heart was beating like a hammer. "What are you doing?" he screamed. "What happens? Do the old people take over the bodies of the young? Is that it?" From the corner of his eye, Pete saw Uncle Ed trying to slip into the room from the kitchen. Pete wheeled around and zigzagged between his father and Milo, barely escaping out the open front door. Keeping to the darkened fields and away from the roads, Pete managed to get away. With tears stinging his eyes, he stumbled through tall, standing rows of ripening corn. Finally, drawn to the glow of an all-night gas station just off the interstate, he lurched onto the blacktop and stood blinking in the glaring lights. "Help me!" he begged a young man who was filling the tank of his brand new sports car. "Please, I need a ride into the city." "Sure," the man shrugged. "I'm going that way anyway." On the road, Pete settled back in the passenger seat and let his mind wander. He had to get to the police, but what could he tell them? Whatever he decided, it had to be soon. He paid no attention to the direction the car was traveling until a huge 18-wheeler passed them on the road. The lights from the truck lit up the face of the young man driving the car. For the first time, Pete noticed the shreds of dry skin peeling from the man's neck. "What?" Pete sat up straight just as the car pulled in behind the warehouse. "Let me go!" he screamed at the stone-faced man who dragged him from the seat. He struggled, but he couldn't break free. Once they were in the underground room, the man released him. Fist clenched, Pete cringed under the steady gaze of Uncle Milo. To his horror, he saw that his mother was laying on one of the metal tables. A thin layer of sticky material covered her like gauze, and she was breathing heavily. She opened her mouth to speak in a labored voice. Don't fight, Peter. It's our way." Strangely, Pete was suddenly calm. Maybe she was right. Turning his head slightly, he saw an elderly man being helped from a table. The man looked as if he was awakening from a gentle slumber. Uncle Milo placed a strong hand on Pete's shoulder as the boy watched his father take his place on one of the tables. "It must be," Milo said gently. "When our home world was destroyed 2 Earth centuries past, this planet was the only place we could find that we could survive." As the old man spoke, Pete felt a growing sense of serenity. "By hiding the truth about our origins, we've been able to live peaceably among the Earthlings without detection. That is all we have ever wanted. But we're not exactly like them. The energy from this sun causes our outer layers to, let's say, wear out. To survive on this planet, every 10 years, those of our race must experience a resting period. A time of change. You mean sort of like a butterfly? Pete questioned. A familiar voice said. Something like that. Pete looked up at Mark. As his older brother helped him to a waiting table, Pete felt a sticky substance being released from his own skin. A soft, thread-like cocoon started to form. This is the time that we are most vulnerable. But don't worry, you're not alone, Mark assured him. We gather together here to guard each other. It won't take very long, then we can all return to our homes, and the Earthlings will never discover our secret. It will be easier for you the next time. Pete nodded, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to drift into a deep, restful sleep. Dude, okay. We've been doing this, this stream for a while, and we're reading a lot of these books. It is very unusual for it to be, we haven't had a lot of endings that are just a misunderstanding of something like that. It turns out you're kind of a monster, but not really a monster kind of deal. We haven't had very many endings like that. A very Goosebumps kind of ending, which I enjoy. So let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. Let's see. Dwayne West said, I'll be 40 on the 21st. Well, happy birthday, Dwayne. Congratulations on making it to the big 4-0, my man. David Denoyer said, family farm, cannibals. Not exactly, but you were trying, and that's an A for effort. Shimmy Glavaka said, Rusty Hulk is my favorite Hulk. And Michelle Antisocial said, oh man, they're molting. You're not that far off. You're not far off from molting. Oh. I put a little numbing spray on my throat. Oh, the things I do for you people. For you people. Hope this doesn't make a loud noise. The things I do. All right. So, but yeah, I feel like we haven't had a lot of stories that where the kid is just kind of mistaken and learning about their future, like that Goosebumps book where it turns out that the girl is also like a bug creature, just like her parents. Love that. Love that. Love that. So, let's go. Oh man. Okay. Shane Migliavacca makes a good point. He said, no dead kids here yet. So, as I said earlier in the show, I do have a little bit of a headache, but it looks like we've got exactly 2 stories left in the even more scary stories for sleepovers. So I can definitely get us through those 2 stories so we can see how this book ends. And maybe, just maybe, I am feeling funky, I gotta be honest. Maybe we'll start Scary Stories 10, or maybe we'll start that next week. But for now, let's roll into it, because I know Shane, I know Keith, you guys are asking for it. Where are the dead kids? Let's find them. Ooh. And listen to this title. Nightmare on Sugar Dome. Cody groaned as he rolled over in bed and looked out of the window. It was a perfect day. The air was clear and the morning sunshine made the deep layer of snow on the ground sparkle. In the distance, Sugar Dome, the state's finest ski area, was a gleaming invitation. Cody looked at the book bag on the chair next to his bed. Why do I have to go to school on a day like this? He grumbled aloud and tunneled under his down comforter. Maybe you don't have to, a little voice in his mind suggested. Peeking out from under the covers, Cody grinned. He had an idea. He hustled out of bed and into his clothes. Then he shoved a pair of ski gloves and goggles into his book bag. He'd have to rent skis and poles, he thought, retrieving a cigar box from his dresser drawer. He counted out some of his birthday money, slipped the cash into his pocket, set his face in a serious expression, and went downstairs. Morning, Dad, he said innocently as he slipped into his place at the table and picked up his glass of juice. Hey, kid, his father smiled. What a great day, eh? The sort of day that makes you want to play hooky. Cody swallowed his juice a little too fast. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, he lied, coughing. You're right. His mom laughed. Dream on, guys. She glanced at her watch. Look at the time. Cody, Dad, I have an early appointment. Cody, Dad, and I have an early appointment. Do you want us to drop you off at school? No thanks, Mom, he answered. I'll take the bus. Cody was already standing at the bus stop at the end of his street when his parents drove by on their way to their real estate office. He smiled and waved, but once their car disappeared around the corner, he stepped behind the tall hedge that grew along the sidewalk, stashing his books under the bushes. Cody waited until the big yellow school bus rumbled by. He boarded the next city bus for Sugar Dome Ski Lodge. The lodge was a great place. There was a video arcade on the lowest level, and the snack bar served the best curly fries and hot chocolate in the whole world. The main hall was a gigantic open fireplace and a fantastic view of Sugar Dome. Cody stood in front of the huge glass wall and gazed up at the sun-drenched mountaintop. Perfectly groomed ski runs snaked upward through the trees. Dozens of brightly dressed skiers zigzagged back and forth down the slopes. "All right," Cody declared, to no one in particular. To one side of the run, he could see the Alpine tramway that carried skiers all the way to the peak. From where he was standing, the heavy cable that supported each of the silvery gondola cars looked like flimsy thread vibrating in the breeze. For just a moment, Cody felt a strange chill, and the light around him seemed to dim. A sensation of panic knotted his stomach, but the creepy feeling vanished as quickly as it had come, and Cody made a beeline for the rental shack. "Hey, Tracy," he called out to the tan young woman behind the counter. "How about a favor?" "What are you doing here, Cody?" his friend asked. "Isn't this a school day?" Yeah, but I had a doctor's appointment this morning, so my folks let me take the rest of the day off," Cody answered. "I thought maybe you'd let me try those new skis you were telling me about." Tracy bought his story, and soon Cody was crunching through the snow toward the tram. He waited on the platform with a few other people as the car bumped to a stop. The ground operator unhooked the latch and slid the doors open. The car was large enough for a dozen people. A metal handrail encircled the inside, and there was a storage rack attached to the inner roof of the car. "Have a good run," the operator commented pleasantly to the group as he reclosed the doors. When the latch clanged shut, Cody felt the same strange chill he had experienced earlier. But then, with a loud hum, the car began its ascent high up the face of Sugar Dome. Cody studied the other passengers. To his left was an elderly couple in matching blue ski jackets. A woman with long blonde ponytail and a tangerine-colored jumpsuit was talking to an odd-looking man who had a cast on his right wrist. The guy gave him the creeps. Cody glanced to his right and met the gaze of a dark-haired girl about his own age. She was with a man and a woman who were most likely her parents. "They must be here on vacation," Cody thought, smiling shyly at the girl. Thump! A loud noise sounded from somewhere above them. "What was that?" the girl with the ponytail cried in alarm. Before anyone could answer, there was a grinding sound and the car lurched back, swinging from side to side. One more bump sent Cody hurtling across the car. His head slammed into the handrail and everything went dark. When Cody came to, everything was still dark. It took him a moment to realize that a large blanket had fallen from the rack above his head and covered him. Pushing it aside, he sat up and looked around. The empty car was stopped at the mountaintop station with its doors open. "Thanks for leaving me here, folks," he muttered to himself. Rubbing the spot where he hit his head, he gathered up his equipment and stepped out of the car. The platform was empty. "I guess the others were in a hurry to get out and didn't see me there," he thought. He stepped into his skis and glided across the packed snow next to a man getting ready to start downhill. "Looks great, doesn't it?" Cody observed. The man took off without saying a word. Cody made a face. Setting his own poles, he pushed down until he felt his skis sliding forward. The crisp air felt wonderful as he picked up speed. By skiing to an uncrowded rope lift about midway down the slope, Cody was able to ride up and ski down several times. He was enjoying himself so much that he forgot all about the dull throbbing in his head. Cody was heading across the hill when a patch of orange in the trees caught his eye. Crunching the edges of his skis into the snow, he stopped. A figure in a bright tangerine-colored jumpsuit was standing half hidden in the undergrowth at the edge of the run. It was the woman with the blonde ponytail, and she was staring right at him. She had some kind of dirt, maybe a huge dark bruise on the side of her face. The glare from the sunlight made it hard to see into the shadows. He skied in a little closer. What in the... Cody looked this way and that, but he saw nothing but pine trees. The woman was gone. He turned back toward the run and almost bumped into a man standing beside him. The broken cast hung from the fellow's right wrist, and he held his head at an odd, tilted angle. The man opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. In frustration, he reached out and gripped one of Cody's ski poles. "Hey, let go! Are you nuts?" Cody yelled. He yanked the pole away and took off down the hill. Upset by the man's strange behavior, Cody stuck to the middle of the slope. He decided not to make another run. "Thanks, Tracy," he called out to his friend as he set the borrowed equipment against the wall in the rental shack. Engrossed in what appeared to be a serious conversation on the phone, Tracy didn't even look in his direction. "Oh my God," Tracy said into the receiver. "When did it happen? Does anybody know who was in it?" When did what happen? Cody wondered as he shuffled back outside. The day was becoming overcast and the breeze turned icy. The interaction with the bizarre guy had made him nervous. He jingled some quarters in his pocket and walked toward the video arcade. Inside, the noise in the crowd made him feel better. Taking up a place at one of his favorite games, Invasion Force from Alpha 5, he dropped a quarter in the slot. "Yes!" he exclaimed when he had downed the last alien spacecraft. Then something drew his attention from the game. The dark-haired girl from the cable car was leaning against the far wall, watching his every move. The commotion of the arcade faded to a soft buzz. It was almost as if everyone else in the room was dissolving away. All he could see were her coal-black eyes. "What's going on?" Cody said aloud. He closed his eyes and opened them again. The girl was gone. Cody gasped in disbelief, but she had simply vanished. Confused and frightened, Cody tried to refocus on the game. But when he shifted his gaze, his heart leapt with terror. Standing behind him, reflected on the glass screen, was the scowling face of the man with the cast. Stunned, Cody saw the image reach out toward him. In panic, he dodged the outstretched fingers and bolted for the door. Once outside, he raced toward the main hall entrance, then skidded to a halt. The elderly couple he had seen on the tramway stood glaring down at him from the huge window wall. Their blue jackets were stained with dark red blood. Turning on his heels, Cody dashed along the now slushy path, splattering clumps of wet snow as he ran. "Tracy!" he gasped as he burst through the doorway of the rental shack. "I don't know what's going on, but I need your help!" But the young man ignored Cody. "I can't believe it," Tracy said softly to another man who was leaning against the counter. "He was only in here a couple of hours ago." "Tracy!" Cody screamed. "He can't hear you." Cody snapped his head up to see the man with the cast standing in the open doorway. One by one, the other passengers stepped into the shadowy room. Cody looked from one to the other. "We can't leave without you, boy," the man whispered. The boy cringed and covered his eyes. "No! I don't believe you! No! I'm going to open my eyes and you'll all be gone! This isn't really happening!" As he spoke, Cody felt the ground grow cold. He opened his eyes and found that he was kneeling in the snow near a pile of twisted metal and broken glass that had once been a cable car. High above, a snapped cable twisted in the wind. Painfully, he watched as a stretcher was loaded into a special ambulance. The small body on the stretcher was completely covered with a heavy plastic material. "It's so heartbreaking," a nearby paramedic noted sadly. "I know his parents. They probably think he's in school." Backing away, Cody sensed that the others were near him. He looked up into the eyes of the man he had been so afraid of. But all of the fear was gone. "It's time to leave," the man said simply. Another cable car slowly appeared, and the doors slid open. Cody watched the ambulance pull away, then stepped into the car. The doors closed, and the car faded into the gathering mist. Whoa! Okay, Shea Migliavacca, you wanted dead kids. You didn't just get dead kids. That was like the creepiest possible dead kid story I think we've read yet. That one really got me. Ugh. I hate the idea of being dead and not knowing it, being a ghost and not knowing it. Very scary to me. And thank you again, guys. I know I'm not reading it 100%. I have been dealing with a migraine all day, but I'm still having a good time with you guys. And And thank you again for your generous tips. I intend to take a few days off very, very soon, and I'm going to use every dollar of these tips to buy stupid video games, because that is clearly what I need and what's going on, what needs to happen. So, just saying. So, any tips go straight into my PS4. Heather Fairchild said, "I'm so late, but I'm here. We're just happy to have you, sweetheart." Shimigliavaka said, "Beyond Sugar Dome." Heather Fairchild said, "Sounds like something I did in high school. Lying about skipping school never ends well. Trust me, I know." Mark Shields said, Yo, my man, how you doing?" Keith Tomlin said, "I see dead people." And Shane Migliavacca said, "Dead kid." And Keith Tomlin said, "Yes, creepy dead kids are the best." I mean, I'm partial. Craig Cohen said, "Did he join all the people who died in skiing accidents?" Yes. Did he join all the people who died in skiing accidents? Apparently, from what I gathered, when he hit his head and woke up and everybody was gone, he was kind of left behind on everybody trying to pass over. And that's why they had to come and find him, because they couldn't move on to whatever is next without the boy. I'm creeping myself out. Honestly, that's the best part about reading scary stories out loud, is creeping yourself out. Let's see. Good. All right. So, Mark Shields, "It is great that Henrik made this before he died." Hey! Damn it, am I a ghost too? Crap. I knew it. All the warning signs were there. Keith Tomlin said, "Where was Sonny Bono?" Too soon, Keith. Too soon. A lot of times my really close friends, I'm always like, "Are you guys even sure I exist? Or am I just like a Tyler Durden Fight Club character?" Because I'm like so outrageous, I could totally see me being a figment of your imagination. So, my friends, here's the dealio for those who are just joining us. We have one story left from Even More Scary Stories for Sleepovers. One story left. And then all we have left in the series is the final book, number 10. So, since I'm feeling a little under the weather tonight, I think I'm going to do just the one more. We're going to finish the book together, and then I'm going to leave you guys. Thank you again so much for hanging out and for your tips. I really do appreciate the tips in particular, because I'm not able to exactly work right now, and I appreciate it. Laser Mazer, Uncle Henny, I made it. You made it just in time for one more spooky one. For the final story of Even More Scary Stories for Sleepovers, Keith Thomas said, "I would hope I have a better imagination than that." Thanks, Keith. All right, my friends. One more scary story, and then I'll see you guys right here next Wednesday. This story is called Danger Island. With a name like that, it's got to be good. There were a lot of reasons why tourists visited Lake Wintoma. Decker Island, however, wasn't one of them. It was a small, bleak circle of land just off the far eastern shore of the otherwise gorgeous lake. The island was, more accurately, a peninsula, but even during the dry season, the boggy tongue of land that connected it to the mainland was usually under 2 inches of water. The townspeople called it Danger Island because of the hazards it posed. Incredibly overgrown, the place was a haven for snakes and insects. And Dr. Rowan Decker. Dr. Decker was a paleobotanist, a scientist who studies ancient plants, and he was the only person who chose to live on the peninsula. He had settled there 20 years before and had built a secluded home. For the most part, he kept to himself, except on the first and third Saturdays of every month. On those days, he made the hour-long drive around the lake to town on the west shore to stock up on supplies. During his visits, he regularly stopped for a snack at the corner diner, where he was often joined by several of the local kids. He entertained them with strange tales of his worldly travels. Decker knew about all kinds of bizarre things, and he would captivate the kids for hours. One day he was in town talking to John and his friends, Rodney and Bethany, about a strange plant he'd come across in his studies, called the Rafflesia. It's the largest flower on the planet, about 3 feet across, Decker said, spreading his arms to show the size. It must be really beautiful, John said in awe. No one he had ever met told better stories than Dr. Decker. Decker curled up his lip in a playful smile. Well, that's a matter of opinion. You see, many people claim that the Rafflesia flower smells an awful lot like rotting meat. Oh, come on, Bethany scoffed, wrinkling her nose. What kind of flower would smell like that? One that was pollinated by flies, Decker answered seriously. They like the way it smells, but I've seen even odder things, he continued. Like what? Rodney asked. The scientist leaned forward. Like plants that eat meat. Plants that strangle the life out of other plants, and a gooey plant-like life form that can move from place to place. John frowned. I've read about meat-eating plants, like the Venus flytrap. They trap insects between their leaves and then dissolve the bodies for food. They're not all that special, but I've never heard about the others. Are they for real? Decker nodded with assurance. They're real, all right. In fact, I have samples growing on the island. The Strangling Fig, for example, is a vine that climbs over and eventually chokes a host tree. It usually grows in rainforests, but I've had luck transplanting such vines to several areas near my lab. What about the gooey thing that moves? Bethany asked. Slime molds, Decker answered. Yes, they grow here. They're found in damp, dark places like under a log or perhaps a basement. A slime mold consumes tiny living things such as bacteria by enveloping them. Cool, John exclaimed. Like the blob in the movies, that creature from outer space. Yes, but if my theories are correct, these things were even more impressive in the past. Perhaps millions of years ago, a distant, larger relative of the modern slime mold had a taste for much larger game. A faraway look settled on Decker's face. We could learn so much more about life on Earth, or about how life on Earth developed, if we could study those ancient plants. The work would be dangerous, but the plants might be difficult to control, but it would be worth it. I've worked hard to genetically peel away the centuries, and I'm very close. A week later on the school playground, John crept up behind Bethany, who was sitting on the lawn, engrossed in a book. In his hand, he cradled a container of tapioca pudding. Bethany didn't notice John until he tipped the pudding onto her hand and yelled, "The blob that devoured San Francisco! It's here!" Bethany jumped up screaming and flicked the gooey mess from her hand while John and Rodney shook with laughter. "You idiots!" she yelled, trying to suppress a smile. "The attack of the mutant slime mold begins," Rodney snickered, handing her a paper towel from his own lunchbox. "Sorry we scared you," John said, unwrapping his sandwich. The 3 kids ate their lunch and talked about everything from soccer practice to homework, but eventually the conversation drifted back to Dr. Decker and his weird plants. "I'd love to see Dr. Decker's slime mold," said Rodney. "I wonder what he meant by bigger game." "Humans," John said laughingly. There was another moment of silence as everyone munched on their sandwiches. Then John had an idea. "Maybe we could see the slime mold," he said excitedly. "What do you mean?" Bethany mumbled with a mouthful of peanut butter and jelly. John rubbed his chin. "We could visit Dr. Decker's lab." "But he never lets anybody come to the island," Rodney said matter-of-factly. "You know that." John smiled. "We could pay a surprise visit." "He wouldn't like that," Bethany said. "He wouldn't have to know," John countered. On the first Saturday of the following month, John, Bethany, and Rodney stood on the dock of the West Shore. "It'll only take about 20 minutes to get across by boat," John assured his friends. It takes three times that to drive around the lake. By the time Dr. Decker gets to town, buys his supplies, and drives home, we can be to the island and back. Don't you want to see what he's got going on over there?" "Yeah," Bethany agreed, jumping down into the boat. Rodney hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he shrugged, climbed aboard, and the 3 left the shore. The only way to approach Decker Island was through a boat channel that ran directly into the dense foliage of East Beach. There, the kids pulled the boat ashore. The house is over there, John pointed toward a 2-story brick structure, half hidden by gigantic trees. Rodney tied a line from the boat to the aerial root of a mangrove tree. Only a sliver of sandy beach separated them from the jungle of bizarre green plant life that populated most of the island. Once at the house, John found an open window on the first floor, and the children slipped inside. The silence pressed in on them like a blanket. The air was heavy and damp. "I think the lab is downstairs," John whispered. Moving quickly, they found the basement laboratory and began to explore. There seemed to be hundreds of plastic and glass jars filled with samples of plant life gathered from the island and the surrounding lake waters. "Yuck!" Rodney held up a vial filled with some disgusting green gook. "What do you think this is?" "Your lunch," Bethany answered with a devilish grin. After searching for a while, John gave a deep sigh. "I guess it really wasn't true. I don't see anything here that is all that unusual." He glanced out the window. "It must be getting late. We better head back." He walked toward the basement stairs when Rodney suddenly let out a yelp. "Ow! I stubbed my toe!" "On what?" John asked. He lifted the wrinkled rug under Rodney's foot. "Look at this!" A tiny handle stuck up from the floor. It was a part of the small wooden hatch, or door. Tugging on the handle, John gazed down into a dark opening. "There's another level," he whispered, grabbing a flashlight from the nearby countertop. "Let's see what's down there." "I get to go first," Rodney demanded. "We wouldn't have found the door if I hadn't stubbed my toe." John handed over the flashlight and the trio started down the wooden stairs, the soggy boards creaking under their weight. Once at the bottom, Rodney stepped out onto the concrete floor and shined the flashlight from side to side. "It's empty," he announced, moving farther into the room. "There isn't a thing here." John and Bethany stepped down. "The floor feels kind of funny," Bethany observed. A peculiar slurping sound echoed through the large room. Rodney turned the flashlight toward the ground. "What in the..." But before he could finish, a thick finger of gooey reddish slime encircled his foot. John watched in stunned silence as the jelly-like ooze slithered up his friend's leg. Rodney began to beat at the sticky goo with the flashlight. In the rocking beam of light, John could see that the entire floor was covered by a thick layer of pulsating muck. "The slime mold!" he screamed. "We've got to get out!" He pushed Bethany back toward the sagging staircase, but when he turned to reach for Rodney, he saw only a quivering mass of crimson slime. From somewhere deep within, his friend uttered a final scream. John felt a slimy thread grasping at his own ankle. With a cry, he leapt for the stairs and clambered for safety, slamming the trapdoor behind him. "Let's get out of here," he shrieked to Bethany. Together, they dove through the still-open window and sprinted for the shore. John thought that his heart would burst from the strain. Once on the beach, Bethany fell sobbing to the sand as John worked his shaking hands to free the boat. The tiny craft had drifted farther into the undergrowth, and he had to clear away the leaves and vines that had clogged their escape. But the harder he worked, the more tangled the boat became. Suddenly, he heard a frantic wail. John lifted his gaze to see Bethany wrapped in a web of vines that hung from a nearby tree. The more he struggled, the more the web tightened. "Help me, John!" she shrieked. He jumped up and tried to pull the grasping tendrils away from his friends, but for every vine he grabbed, 2 more whipped in to take its place. Bethany disappeared before his eyes into a tangle of vegetation. Helplessly, he listened to her last muffled squeals. With tears flowing down his cheeks, John stared at the boat. It was covered with deadly vines. Some lay perfectly still, others twitched slightly as if waiting for him to approach. John set his face in determination. "The bridge," he said aloud, remembering how Dr. Decker had once described a low bridge he had built across the bog so that he could drive his four-wheeler to the mainland even during the rainy season. Setting out for the south side of the island, John didn't take long to reach the escape route, or to see what was impassable. That it was impassable. Deadly vines covered every inch of the rough wooden structure. On either side of the bridge stretched several hundred yards of muddy, sopping bog. It was probably filled with snakes and who knows what else, but it was the only way off the island. Taking a deep breath, John took a step into the muck and sank to his ankles. He tried another step and another, and even though the water was only about an inch deep, it was almost impossible to move. He was stuck. Pulling up hard on his leg, his foot suddenly wrenched free, but his shoe stayed behind in the dark, sinking mud. Afraid of what might be waiting in the unseen sludge, John hesitated to take another step. "This is impossible," he moaned. Then he noticed a pair of huge, oval green leaves that looked as if they were floating just at the surface of the bog. He'd seen leaves like that, but smaller, somewhere before. He couldn't remember where. They looked like gigantic lily pads. He recalled Decker telling him about water lilies in the Amazon jungle that could actually support the weight of a child. Shading his eyes against the glare of the sunlight on the water, he saw that there were several of the lily pad-type plants. They formed an almost continuous living bridge to the opposite shore. "It might work," he said to himself with renewed hope. Carefully, he raised his bare foot and stepped onto the plant. It seemed sturdy. John shifted his weight and hoisted himself onto the thick, spongy leaf. It sank a little way into the mud, but it did hold his weight. Slowly and carefully, he worked his way across the bog from leaf to leaf. "I'm gonna make it," he thought, allowing a shiver of elation to course through his body. Just a few more yards and he would be on solid ground. He jumped to the next leaf, but his foot slipped out from under him. There was something coating the surface. Something sticky, slimy. Struggling to stand, he slid toward the central vein of the strange double leaf. In a flash, the two halves slammed shut. "Help!" he cried out to no one. He pushed with all his strength, but the leaves wouldn't budge. Then he tugged at the tough, sword-like spines that were crisscrossed along the edges of his emerald prison. It was no use. With a gurgling sound, a thick, sticky fluid began to bubble up around his ankles. Too late, John remembered where he had seen the tiny plants, similar to the one that now had him trapped. "They're not all that special," he said to Decker. But now, as the fluid rose higher and higher, he knew that he had been wrong. This Venus flytrap was indeed very special and very hungry. He screamed out in terror, but there was no one to hear. Whoa! Even more scary stories for sleepovers definitely ended in the tradition of scary stories for sleepovers, with another vicious child coming to their end. Woof! Oh my goodness. All right, let's see what you guys are saying. Michelle Antisocial said, "I love slime mold." Mark Shield said, "Yay!" Alexandra Marie Harker said, "Someone say Jumanji?" Shami Liavaka said, "All this slime and tentacles, is this hentai?" And Heather Fairchild said, "The bog of eternal death." All right, my friends. I'm going to need to call it a night. I've been dealing with a migraine all day. I'm not feeling super good, but we had a pretty good night of stories. And if you missed it, you can always watch the repeat. It's on my YouTube channel or right here on Facebook. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me. I'll be back next Wednesday, where we will begin the final book of the Scary Stories for Sleepovers series, Scary Stories for Sleepovers number 10. It's the last one, my friends, and I'm very excited to see what it's all about. But for now, I'm going to leave you. Thank you again for your generous tips. You're welcome to tip after I shut off the show if you feel so inclined. I do appreciate it. Like I said, I'm taking the weekend off, so I'm going to spend your tips on video games because I'm going to be reckless this week. Usually I spend it on groceries. But thank you guys so much. I'm rambling. I'm very tired. Had a great time with you guys, and I cannot wait to see you next Wednesday right here on Facebook. So thank you again so much, and I will catch you then. Stay safe, stay well, take care of each other. Thank you again so much.